California. Sunshine, beaches, Hollywood dreams. But beneath the golden glow lies a history drenched in darkness. For decades, this state of palm trees and promises became something else entirely. A place where the freeways, the suburbs, and even the quiet neighborhoods turned into hunting grounds for some of America's most disturbed minds. They moved through the night like ghosts, each one different, each one unforgettable, and each one left behind a trail of fear so deep their names are still whispered today, decades later. From the bustling streets of Los Angeles to the silent corners of Sacramento, evil wore many faces here, some charming, some quiet, and some unmistakably cruel. Tonight, we step into those shadows. We will revisit the stories that scarred California's golden image, stories of manipulation, obsession, and pure malice. These are the killers who made the state bleed. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from, and what are you doing while you listen to this true crime documentary? And make sure to subscribe, because what you're about to hear are the true crime stories from America's most haunted corners. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the Toolbox Killers, 1979. November 1979, Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Detectives sit around a small table, faces pale, shoulders tense. A reel-to-reel tape recorder is placed before them, one of several pieces of evidence seized from a van that had recently come under investigation. The tape is labeled simply, "For Fun." When they press play, what follows is so horrifying that one of the investigators reportedly leaves the room within minutes. What they hear is not a movie, not a prank, but the sounds of a young woman in unimaginable distress. The tape lasts for over an hour, documenting the final moments of one of the victims of two men who would later become known as the Toolbox Killers. That tape became the key evidence in one of California's most disturbing criminal cases. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker and Roy Lewis Norris first crossed paths in 1977 inside the California Men's Colony, a state prison in San Luis Obispo. Both were repeat offenders. Bittaker was serving time for assault and attempted theft, Norris for multiple violent crimes. Prison records and later testimony reveal that the two men bonded over shared fantasies of control and violence. During their time behind bars, they began planning a future project, a term they used to describe what they intended to do once released. Bittaker was the older of the two, highly intelligent but manipulative. Norris was quieter, easily influenced, and eager to impress. Together, they were a lethal combination. Bittaker was released first in late 1978. He found work at a small machine shop in Torrance, California, and maintained a clean public image. Norris was released a few months later, and the two quickly reunited. They began driving aimlessly through the Los Angeles area, scouting locations, and testing methods to lure potential victims. By early 1979, they had purchased a silver-gray GMC van. Bittaker modified it himself, removing the back seats and installing a bed, heavy curtains, and a large chest filled with hand tools, pliers, screwdrivers, and wrenches. They nicknamed it the Murder Mac. Their attacks began in June 1979. Their first known victim was Lucinda Schaefer, 16 years old, who disappeared after leaving a church event in Redondo Beach. Bittaker and Norris later described how they had coaxed her into the van, taken her to a remote area in the San Gabriel Mountains, and ended her life there. Her body was never recovered. 2 weeks later, on July 8th, they struck again. Andrea Hall, 18, was hitchhiking along Pacific Coast Highway when they offered her a ride. She accepted, unaware that she was stepping into the same van. Witnesses later reported seeing her talking to two men in a silver vehicle before disappearing. Like Lucinda, she was never found. By September, their violence had escalated. They began carrying a Polaroid camera, documenting their victims before and after the attacks. They also started recording audio, evidence that would later shock investigators and haunt them for the rest of their careers. On September 3rd, they abducted Jacqueline Gilliam, 15, and Leah Lamp, 13, near Hermosa Beach. The two were taken to the mountains and kept for nearly 2 days before being killed. Bittaker and Norris discarded their remains near a fire road, covering them with brush. Their final known victim, Shirley Ledford, 16, was abducted on Halloween night, October 31, 1979, after finishing her shift at a restaurant in Sunland, Tujunga. This was the crime recorded on the now infamous tape, a recording so graphic that it was never played publicly, only summarized in court. The audio proved beyond any doubt what the two men had done and the sheer cruelty behind it. The investigation that led to their arrest began when Norris confided in a friend, Joseph Jackson, a former Navy man. Norris told Jackson in shocking detail about the crimes he and Bittaker had committed. Jackson immediately went to the police. Within days, authorities had Norris in custody. Under interrogation, Norris broke down and confessed to everything. His statements matched missing persons reports and led detectives to the van, the photographs, and the tapes. He identified remote areas in the San Gabriel Mountains where several victims had been taken. Search teams later recovered partial remains and personal items confirming the victims' identities. Bittaker, meanwhile, was arrested at his workplace in Torrance. When police searched his apartment and van, they found hundreds of photos, tools, and the recorded tapes, all evidence of meticulous planning. The discovery of the tape was what ultimately sealed their fate. Detectives who listened to it later described it as the most distressing evidence they had ever encountered. One officer reportedly said, "That tape will haunt me for the rest of my life." In 1980, the case went to trial. Roy Norris accepted a plea bargain in exchange for testifying against Bittaker. He received 45 years to life in prison and was later denied parole multiple times before dying in custody in 2020. Lawrence Bittaker, on the other hand, showed no remorse. During the trial, he appeared calm and analytical, even describing aspects of the crimes in a detached, methodical tone. The prosecution presented over 500 pieces of evidence, including the Polaroid photographs, tool marks, and Norris's testimony. After a 6-week trial, the jury found Bittaker guilty on 5 counts of murder, along with numerous charges of kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to death in March 1981. When asked if he had anything to say, Bittaker replied simply, "No." He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row until his death in 2019 at the age of 79. He never expressed regret for his actions. The Toolbox Killers case stands as one of the most disturbing in California's criminal history, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of how deliberate and organized they were. Both men had met by chance in prison, formed an alliance, and upon release, turned their violent ideas into reality with horrifying precision. The evidence they left behind, the photos, the tape, the planning, provided prosecutors with an airtight case, but it also left behind a lasting mark on everyone who worked it. Many investigators later said it was the worst case they had ever seen. Public reaction at the time was one of pure disbelief. The idea that two seemingly ordinary men could systematically abduct and torture strangers without a clear motive shook California's sense of safety to its core. Today, the Toolbox Killers remain a grim reminder of how cruelty can hide in plain sight, and how a single partnership can multiply destruction. While the Toolbox Killers preyed from their van, another Californian killer kept trophies, and he became known to millions through television. Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer, 1970s. 1978, Los Angeles, California. Millions of Americans tune in to watch one of the most popular TV shows of the decade, The Dating Game. A smiling young man with long hair and a confident charm sits on stage, answering playful questions from a female contestant. The studio audience laughs and cheers as he flirts and jokes with her. His name, the host announces, is Rodney Alcala, a successful photographer from Hollywood. He wins the round. The audience applauds. But what no one knows, not the woman on stage, not the viewers at home, not even the producers, is that the man smiling into the camera had already taken lives. This wasn't just another contestant looking for love. This was a predator hiding in plain sight. Rodney Alcala's story began far from the glitz of television studios. Born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucor in San Antonio, Texas in 1943, he grew up in a troubled home. His father abandoned the family when he was a child, and his mother moved him and his siblings to Los Angeles. Despite the instability, Alcala was bright, highly intelligent even, with an IQ reportedly above 130. After high school, he joined the U.S. Army in 1961, but his time in uniform was short-lived. He was discharged after suffering what military psychiatrists described as a nervous breakdown. That early instability would later prove to be a warning sign of what was to come. By his mid-20s, Alcala had reinvented himself as a promising young photographer. He attended UCLA's School of Fine Arts, blending easily into the creative culture of 1960s California. Outwardly, he was charming, articulate, and socially confident, qualities that allowed him to earn trust easily. But behind that polished exterior, he was already beginning to act on darker impulses. In 1968, a brutal incident exposed who Alcala really was. A passerby in Los Angeles saw him lure an 8-year-old girl into his apartment. Sensing something was wrong, the witness alerted police. When officers arrived, they found the child inside, badly injured, but alive. Alcala fled before he could be arrested, disappearing across the country. He resurfaced years later in New York City, living under the name John Berger. He enrolled in film school at New York University, where one of his professors was a young Roman Polanski. To his classmates, Alcala seemed eccentric but harmless, just another aspiring artist with a mysterious past. In reality, he was a fugitive. In 1971, the FBI added Alcala to their most wanted list after linking him to the California attack. He was finally recognized by 2 former students from NYU who contacted authorities. Alcala was arrested and extradited to California to face charges. He pleaded guilty to a lesser offense and served a brief prison sentence. But in a decision that would later horrify investigators, he was released after just a few years, despite evaluations warning that he remained a danger to the public. Upon his release in the mid-1970s, Alcala wasted no time returning to his old habits. He began approaching women and teenagers in public places, introducing himself as a professional photographer looking for models. He carried a camera everywhere, using it to gain trust, start conversations, and convince strangers to pose for him. Many of those photographs, numbering in the hundreds, were later recovered from his home. Most were portraits, young women, men, and children, smiling into his lens. To this day, not all of them have been identified. While posing as a photographer, Alcala committed a series of violent crimes across California. His victims were found in remote locations, canyons, parks, and mountainsides, often showing evidence of assault and strangulation. Between 1977 and 1979, at least 7 confirmed murders were later attributed to him, though police believe the true number may be far higher. His known victims include Ellen Hover, a New York socialite whose disappearance led to the discovery of Alcala's alias, and Robin Samsoe, a 12-year-old girl from Huntington Beach, whose case would finally lead to his downfall. The Robin Samsoe case marked the beginning of the end for Alcala. In June 1979, Robin disappeared while riding her bicycle to a ballet class. Her friends told police they'd seen her talking to a man with a camera near the beach. Days later, her body was found in the nearby mountains. Police distributed a composite sketch of the suspect, and several people, including Alcala's former parole officer, recognized him immediately. When officers searched Alcala's storage locker in Seattle, they discovered a trove of incriminating items, jewelry belonging to victims, hundreds of photographs, and other personal belongings linking him to multiple unsolved cases. He was arrested shortly afterward in Monterey Park, California, and charged with the murder of Robin Samsoe. Alcala's trial began in 1980, attracting massive media attention. The idea that a man who had appeared on a popular TV show, charming audiences and producers alike, could secretly be a serial killer fascinated and horrified the public. Prosecutors presented physical evidence, including jewelry and fibers, along with eyewitness testimony placing Alcala near Robin on the day she disappeared. The defense argued circumstantial evidence, claiming others could have planted the items. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury convicted Alcala of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. But the legal process didn't end there. Over the next 3 decades, Alcala's conviction would be overturned twice on procedural grounds, leading to multiple retrials. Each time, prosecutors added new evidence connecting him to additional murders, including those of Georgia Wickstead, Charlotte Lamb, Jill Barcombe, and Jill Parenteau. By 2010, forensic advancements, including DNA testing, tied Alcala to at least 5 confirmed murders in California and 2 in New York. That year, after years of appeals and retrials, he was once again found guilty, and again sentenced to death. The public reaction was a mix of fascination and disbelief. The idea that a known killer had once been broadcast into millions of homes on a light-hearted dating show seemed surreal. It later emerged that the dating game producers had run a background check on Alcala, but his earlier record hadn't appeared due to the way California's databases were managed at the time. The woman who appeared on the show with him, Cheryl Bradshaw, later recalled that she had refused to go on the date, saying she found him creepy. It may have saved her life. In prison, Alcala remained largely unrepentant. He gave few interviews and rarely spoke about his crimes. In 2010, police released hundreds of his recovered photographs to the public in hopes of identifying more victims. Dozens were recognized, though many remain unknown. Rodney Alcala died in 2021 at age 77, while still awaiting execution at California's Corcoran State Prison. Authorities believe his victim count could exceed 100, spanning California, New York, and possibly other states. Rodney Alcala's case remains one of the most disturbing examples of manipulation and deception in modern American crime. He was intelligent, confident, and socially skilled, able to mask the reality of who he was behind charm and a camera lens. He didn't just fool strangers, he fooled an entire television audience. And as investigators would later say, no one ever smiled for his camera twice. But for years, California's most elusive predator wasn't caught on camera. He was hiding in plain sight inside the homes he once protected. Richard Ramirez, The Night Stalker, 1984 to 1985. August 31st, 1985. East Los Angeles. A man in his mid-20s is running through the streets, sweat pouring down his face, eyes wide with panic. Behind him, a crowd of furious residents is closing in, shouting, chasing, grabbing whatever they can find to stop him. He's desperate, trying to escape, but there's nowhere left to go. Moments later, the mob catches up. The man is pulled to the ground, beaten, and held there until police arrive. When officers finally push through the crowd, they recognize him instantly. It's the face that's been on every TV screen, every front page, every radio report for weeks. This isn't just any criminal. This is the Night Stalker. The man who terrorized California for more than a year, breaking into homes, taking lives at random, and leaving behind chaos and fear, had finally been caught. To understand how California reached that moment, we need to go back to where it began. June 1984, Los Angeles. Police respond to an apartment in the Glassell Park neighborhood. Inside, they find 79-year-old Jenny Vinco, brutally attacked in her own home. There was no clear motive, no forced entry, and nothing of value taken. It looked personal, but detectives couldn't find any connection between the victim and a suspect. It would take months before they realized this was just the beginning. By the spring of 1985, the pattern became impossible to ignore. A series of violent home invasions had erupted across Southern California. The attacks seemed entirely random. Young and old, rich and poor, men and women, no one was safe. The intruder moved through neighborhoods at night, slipping into unlocked homes or prying open windows. He sometimes left behind strange symbols or phrases, and often used whatever object he found inside the home as a weapon. His unpredictability terrified the city. Residents began reinforcing doors and windows, sleeping with lights on, and checking behind every shadow. Hardware stores ran out of locks and motion lights. Gun stores reported record sales. Los Angeles had faced crime before, but this was different. This felt unstoppable. Multiple police departments were now involved. Los Angeles County, San Francisco, and Orange County, all tracing what they believed was the same individual. Yet with no clear pattern or motive, investigators struggled to keep up. Then came the first real clue. At several scenes, detectives discovered a distinct footprint, a rare size 11.5 Avia sneaker. That print connected multiple crime scenes across counties. Still, the killer stayed one step ahead, striking without warning, leaving only confusion behind. Then, in August 1985, the break finally came. In the quiet community of Mission Viejo, a teenage boy saw a suspicious man leave his neighborhood late at night. The man's car seemed out of place. The teen noted part of the license plate and told his parents, who alerted police. That single act led investigators to a stolen vehicle later abandoned in Los Angeles. Inside were fingerprints, and they matched a name already in the criminal database. Richard Ramirez, 25 years old. A drifter, known for burglary, drugs, and petty theft, but nothing like this. When police released his photo to the public, it appeared on every newspaper and television broadcast across California. Within hours, his face became the most recognizable in the state. Ramirez, unaware that his identity had been exposed, boarded a bus to return to Los Angeles. But it didn't take long for passengers to recognize him. A woman whispered his name. Others began to react. As the tension grew, Ramirez fled the bus, running through the streets of East L.A., where local residents, now aware of who he was, chased him down and held him until the police arrived. After more than a year of terror, the Night Stalker was in custody. The trial that followed became one of the most infamous in California's history. From the beginning, Ramirez seemed to enjoy the attention. In court, he smiled, laughed, and at times shouted strange phrases to reporters and spectators. At one point, he raised his hand to reveal a symbol drawn on his palm, a gesture that sent a wave of unease through the courtroom. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, ballistic matches, shoe prints, and testimony from survivors tied him to a staggering list of crimes: 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and 11 assaults, along with numerous burglaries. Prosecutors presented a timeline that showed how he had moved across counties, choosing homes at random, leaving little forensic evidence except those distinctive sneaker prints. His unpredictability, they said, was what made him so difficult to catch. On September 20th, 1989, after 4 years of proceedings, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on 43 felony counts, including 13 counts of murder. During sentencing, the judge read the decision: death by gas chamber. Ramirez showed no emotion. Instead, he smirked and said, "No big deal. Death always comes with the territory." The statement stunned everyone in the courtroom. Following his conviction, Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain on death row for the next 2 decades. He received letters from admirers, interviews from journalists, and even marriage proposals, a disturbing reflection of the public's fascination with serial killers. Psychologists described him as a textbook case of antisocial personality disorder, highly manipulative, remorseless, and deeply detached from empathy. Over the years, he gave several interviews, but none offered real insight. His answers were cryptic, taunting, and void of responsibility. He died in 2013 at the age of 53 from natural causes related to cancer, long before his sentence could be carried out. The Night Stalker case changed California forever. It forced law enforcement agencies to improve inter-county cooperation and information sharing. It also exposed how vulnerable people felt in their own homes, a fear that lingered long after his arrest. For months, Los Angeles had lived in terror of the unknown. People who had once trusted their neighborhoods learned to fear every sound outside, every creak in the dark. Richard Ramirez didn't just take lives. He disrupted the very idea of safety. He turned one of America's brightest cities into a place where darkness felt inescapable. Because Ramirez wasn't a killer who followed a pattern. He didn't have a type. He represented something far worse, unpredictability. And for that year between 1984 and 1985, Los Angeles learned what it meant to truly fear the night. But Richard Ramirez wasn't California's only predator with a method. Another Californian was turning his house into a quiet graveyard. Dorothea Puente, The Death House Landlady, 1980s, November 11, 1988, Sacramento, California. Police officers stand in the backyard of a quiet two-story Victorian home on F Street. The garden looks tidy, well-kept, with rows of flowers and a small decorative fountain. But beneath the soil lies something far more disturbing. An officer digs into a soft patch of dirt and hits something solid. The team pauses. As they clear away more earth, a shape begins to emerge, a human form wrapped in fabric. Moments later, a second body is found, then another. Standing nearby is the homeowner, Dorothea Puente, a 59-year-old landlady known for her kindness toward the elderly and the homeless. She's wearing a pale blue dress, her silver hair neatly curled. As police continue to dig, Dorothea serves them coffee and cookies, smiling politely. By the end of the day, 7 bodies would be uncovered from that garden, all former tenants of her boarding house. Dorothea Puente's story begins decades earlier, and it is one of reinvention, manipulation, and deception. She was born Dorothea Helen Gray in Redlands, California, in 1929. Her childhood was harsh. Both parents struggled with addiction and passed away while she was still a child. After years in orphanages and foster care, Dorothea learned early how to survive by adapting and by lying when necessary. As an adult, she created a new image for herself. By her 30s, she was presenting as a respectable, caring woman, polite, well-dressed, and generous. But behind that image was a long record of fraud and theft. In the 1960s and 70s, she was arrested several times for forging checks and running small-scale scams. After one sentence for check fraud in 1962, she served less than a year before being released. Later, she operated an unlicensed boarding home for elderly tenants, which was shut down after reports of neglect and theft. Despite repeated arrests, Dorothea always managed to start over under a new name or new persona. By the early 1980s, she was again running a boarding house, this time legally, at 1426 F Street in Sacramento. To her neighbors, she appeared to be a kind-hearted woman who took in those no one else would, the elderly, people with disabilities, and recovering addicts. She dressed modestly, attended church, donated to local charities, and hosted neighborhood dinners. Few questioned her motives. Her method of operation was simple but effective. Dorothea targeted individuals who were vulnerable, particularly those receiving government benefits. She offered them room and board, helped them manage their paperwork, and often became the payee for their Social Security checks. Once she gained control of their finances, many of her tenants mysteriously vanished. She told neighbors and social workers that the missing tenants had simply moved away or found jobs elsewhere. Sometimes she forged letters in their names to keep collecting their benefits. For years, her scheme went unnoticed. In 1982, Dorothea was arrested for stealing government checks and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. She served only 3 before being released on parole in 1985. One of her parole conditions was to stay away from the elderly and those receiving government aid. But almost immediately, she returned to her boarding house and resumed taking in new tenants, many of them referred by social workers who saw her as a compassionate caretaker. By 1988, suspicions began to surface again. A social worker named Judy Moyes became concerned when one of her clients, Alvaro Bert Montoya, a man with learning difficulties, stopped showing up for scheduled meetings. Bert had been living at Dorothea's home, and when Judy visited to ask about him, Dorothea calmly explained that he had moved to Mexico with a family friend. The story didn't add up. Judy reported her concerns to the police, who decided to visit the property. When officers arrived on November 11th, they were met by a polite and cooperative Dorothea. She gave them permission to search the home and backyard. As they dug into the soil, they soon found what appeared to be human remains. Dorothea remained composed throughout the discovery. She told detectives that one of her tenants, a man named Chief, had been responsible for burying animals in the yard. Her calm demeanor made investigators uneasy. After the first body was uncovered, police asked Dorothea to stay in town for questioning. She agreed, but requested permission to go out for coffee at a nearby hotel. The officers allowed it. Instead of returning, she vanished. Within hours, Dorothea Puente had fled Sacramento. Her disappearance sparked a statewide manhunt. For several days, she remained on the run, traveling south to Los Angeles under a false name. There, she checked into a small motel and struck up a conversation with an elderly man at a local bar. She told him she was a nurse who had recently moved to the city. When he later recognized her face on television, he contacted police. On November 17, 1988, Dorothea Puente was arrested in Los Angeles without resistance. She was flown back to Sacramento to face charges of multiple murders. The following year, investigators continued searching the F Street property. In total, 7 victims were confirmed buried in her yard, and 2 additional victims were linked through forensic evidence elsewhere. Most of them were elderly boarders whose benefit checks Dorothea had been cashing for years. Her trial began in 1992 and lasted more than a year. Prosecutors presented a mountain of financial evidence, forged checks, falsified letters, and testimony from former tenants. They argued that Dorothea's motive was simple: money. The defense painted her as a woman who took in difficult people and became overwhelmed, claiming that her tenants had died of natural causes and that she panicked about reporting the deaths. The jury didn't buy it. On August 26, 1993, Dorothea Puente was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, and Benjamin Fink. The jury deadlocked on 6 additional counts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Public reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Many in Sacramento had seen Dorothea as a kind, grandmotherly figure, a woman who wore neat dresses, attended church, and helped those on the margins. The idea that she had been burying her tenants in her own backyard shattered that illusion. Reporters nicknamed her the Death House Landlady. Even in prison, Dorothea maintained her innocence. In letters to reporters, she claimed she had helped people who no one else cared about, and insisted she was being punished for her generosity. She died in 2011 at age 82, still declaring that she had never killed anyone. The case of Dorothea Puente remains one of California's most unsettling crimes, not because of violence in the traditional sense, but because of its quiet deceit. She didn't stalk her victims on the streets or break into homes under cover of darkness. She invited them in, offered them safety, and made them trust her, before using that trust for her own gain. Dorothea Puente's story showed that not all killers hide behind menace. Some hide behind a smile, but not all killers hid behind kindness. Some flaunted their arrogance in plain sight. Randy Kraft, the Scorecard Killer, 1970s-1980s, May 14, 1983, Orange County, California. Just before dawn, a California Highway Patrol officer spots a Toyota Celica weaving across Interstate 5. The driver appears to be intoxicated. When the officer pulls the car over near Mission Viejo, the man behind the wheel, a clean-cut, 38-year-old computer programmer named Randy Kraft, steps out, calm but unsteady. As the officer speaks to him, he notices something unsettling. In the passenger seat is another man, motionless, slumped against the door. At first glance, the officer thinks he's asleep, but within seconds, it becomes clear the man is dead. The victim is Marine Terry Gambrell, 25 years old, his body showing clear signs of violence. On the floorboard, officers find a bottle of beer, an open briefcase, and a crumpled piece of paper covered in neatly typed names and cryptic phrases. That document would soon become infamous as the Scorecard, a coded list believed to represent dozens of men who had been murdered over more than a decade. Randy Stephen Kraft was not an obvious suspect for one of California's deadliest serial cases. Born in Long Beach in 1945, he grew up in a middle-class family and excelled academically. Teachers described him as polite, intelligent, and ambitious. After graduating from high school, Kraft attended Claremont Men's College, where he majored in economics and political science. He volunteered for liberal political causes and even worked briefly on a campaign for Robert F. Kennedy. After college, Kraft served briefly in the Air Force before being discharged on medical grounds. He returned to California and took up work in the computer industry, where colleagues knew him as dependable and sharp-minded. Outwardly, he led an ordinary life, social, articulate, and intelligent. But beneath that normal appearance, Kraft had already begun to live a double life. By the early 1970s, reports of young men disappearing from Orange County, Los Angeles, and surrounding areas were becoming disturbingly frequent. Many were hitchhikers, Marines, or young men leaving bars late at night. Their bodies were found along freeways and remote stretches of land, often showing signs of restraint or heavy intoxication. In several cases, investigators noted that the victims had been given high doses of sedatives or alcohol before death. Traces of tranquilizers, Valium, and other substances were common. Some victims were found partially clothed, with evidence suggesting they'd been manipulated or posed after death. What made the pattern hard to detect was geography. The killings stretched across multiple jurisdictions: Orange County, Los Angeles, Riverside, San Diego, and even Oregon. Different police departments investigated different victims, often without realizing the cases were connected. For nearly a decade, Randy Kraft operated undetected, taking advantage of this lack of coordination. Investigators would later piece together Kraft's movements using receipts, travel records, and later, the scorecard. The list contained 61 coded entries such as Airplane Hill, Marine Head BP, and EDM. Each phrase appeared to reference a specific victim, location, or identifying detail only Kraft would understand. At least 16 entries were eventually linked to known murder victims through cross-referencing police reports, autopsy records, and forensic evidence. Detectives also recovered Polaroid photographs from Kraft's home, showing several men, some alive, others appearing deceased. Tire tracks, carpet fibers, and hair samples from his car were matched to multiple crime scenes across California. It became clear that Kraft's crimes were not random. He was methodical, organized, and deliberate. He targeted young men, often servicemen or hitchhikers, who were easy to approach and unlikely to be missed immediately. Many were last seen getting into a car matching Kraft's vehicle. The victims were typically drugged, overpowered, and killed before being dumped along freeways. By the late 1970s, the killings had drawn comparisons to other predators operating at the time, such as Patrick Kearney and William Bonin, both of whom targeted young men in Southern California. At one point, investigators considered the possibility of multiple killers operating simultaneously, a theory later confirmed when the freeway killer label was linked to several different offenders. But what set Randy Kraft apart was the scale of his operation and the precision of his record-keeping. The Scorecard became one of the most chilling documents in American criminal history. Each cryptic phrase corresponded to a man's death, a private codebook of victims that Kraft appeared to maintain like a ledger. When questioned, Kraft denied any involvement, claiming the list was simply a collection of jokes or memories related to friends and co-workers, but the evidence said otherwise. Following his arrest in 1983, investigators launched one of the most extensive forensic inquiries in California history. Dozens of detectives from multiple counties and the U.S. military worked to identify victims connected to Kraft. Search warrants uncovered thousands of items of potential evidence: prescription bottles, Polaroid photographs, maps, and clippings. Forensic analysis linked Kraft to at least 16 confirmed murders, though investigators strongly suspected the real number was far higher, possibly over 60. The investigation also revealed his pattern of interstate travel. Kraft frequently drove between California and Oregon, often along major freeways where bodies had been discovered. He also visited friends and acquaintances in the military, giving him access to barracks in nearby towns where several victims were last seen. The level of organization, combined with his intelligence and lack of a clear motive, made the case one of the most complex serial investigations in California's history. Kraft's trial began in 1988 at the Orange County Superior Court, 5 years after his arrest. Prosecutors presented over 11,000 pieces of evidence, including fingerprints, hair samples, and matching carpet fibers from his car that corresponded to multiple crime scenes. The key piece, however, remained the scorecard. Though Kraft refused to explain it, experts testified that its entries could not have been random. Each one corresponded directly with a confirmed victim or known incident. Over the course of the trial, 160 witnesses were called. The defense argued that Kraft was being scapegoated and that the evidence was circumstantial. They claimed others may have used his car or had access to his home, but the sheer weight of physical and forensic proof was overwhelming. After nearly a year of testimony, the jury deliberated for 11 days before reaching a verdict. On May 12, 1989, Randy Kraft was convicted of 16 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and multiple counts of sodomy and drugging victims. 2 months later, he was sentenced to death. In the years since, investigators have continued to review unsolved cases that fit Kraft's pattern. Some estimates suggest he may be responsible for as many as 67 murders, though that number remains unproven. The scorecard itself remains partially undeciphered. Several entries are still unexplained to this day. Randy Kraft has consistently maintained his innocence, refusing to discuss the list or his alleged victims. He remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he has spent decades filing appeals that have so far all been denied. The case of Randy Kraft stands out not just for its brutality, but for its meticulousness. Unlike many killers driven by impulse or anger, Kraft treated his crimes as something to be documented, categorized, almost as if he were keeping score in a twisted ledger of live. As he turned California's highways into his hunting ground and used a simple notepad to record the end of each victim's journey. To this day, many of those names on the list remain unidentified, silent entries in a code that only Randy Kraft can truly explain. Joseph James DeAngelo, The Golden State Killer, 1970s-1986, caught 2018. April 24, 2018, Citrus Heights, California. Police vehicles quietly surround a modest single-story home in a quiet Sacramento suburb. The man inside is 72 years old, retired, soft-spoken, and known to neighbors as a former police officer who spent his days tinkering in the garage or shopping for groceries with his fiancée. When officers move in, he doesn't resist. His name is Joseph James DeAngelo. That night, detectives confirm what California has been waiting decades to hear. The man they've arrested is the Golden State Killer, one of the most prolific and elusive serial offenders in American history. For over 40 years, the identity of this man had haunted investigators. He had gone by many names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. Now, through a single strand of DNA and an unprecedented use of genealogy, the truth had finally surfaced. To understand how Joseph DeAngelo managed to evade capture for so long, we need to go back to the beginning, to California in the 1970s. The state was booming. New neighborhoods were rising across Sacramento, filled with young families chasing suburban dreams. But by the mid-1970s, fear had settled over those tidy cul-de-sacs. It began with a string of burglaries. Between 1973 and 1975, a mysterious prowler was targeting homes in Visalia, often breaking in to steal small, personal items, rings, photos, small mementos. He wasn't after money or valuables. Police dubbed him the Visalia Ransacker. In 1975, the pattern escalated. During one confrontation, the intruder shot and killed Claude Snelling, a local journalism professor who tried to protect his teenage daughter from being abducted. The suspect escaped, and the case went cold. Months later, a similar crime wave began 200 miles north in Sacramento County, BC. At this time, the intruder's behavior had evolved. From 1976 to 1979, the East Area Rapist terrorized the Sacramento suburbs. He attacked couples in their homes, binding his victims with shoelaces, often using towels or blinds as makeshift gags. His methods were meticulous. He studied the houses beforehand, sometimes breaking in days before to unlock windows or leave ropes hidden near beds. He taunted police and media, even calling his victims afterward to whisper threats. The community was paralyzed with fear. Gun sales spiked, locks were reinforced, and people began sleeping with lights on. Neighborhood watch programs formed almost overnight. The East Area Rapist became one of the most hunted criminals in California's history. Yet despite dozens of composite sketches, police roadblocks, and hundreds of tips, he always managed to vanish before patrols arrived. By the time the attack stopped in Northern California in 1979, the tally was staggering: over 50 assaults and several murders. But what authorities didn't yet realize was that their suspect had simply moved south. Between 1979 and 1986, a new series of killings began across Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties. The unknown offender broke into homes, attacked couples, and left scenes with the same binding patterns, knots, and stolen trinkets seen in Sacramento years earlier. Investigators in Southern California called him the original Night Stalker, unaware that he was the same man who had terrorized the capital region. His victims were found in their own bedrooms, many in suburban areas that had once felt completely safe. Forensic evidence and crime scene patterns showed clear similarities between the East Area Rapist and the new suspect, but at the time, the technology didn't exist to confirm it. For decades, the cases remained separate mysteries, hundreds of miles apart, linked only by suspicion. By the late 1980s, the attacks had stopped, and the Golden State Killer simply disappeared. Decades passed, investigators retired, files gathered dust, but the victims' families never gave up, and neither did the new generation of detectives who inherited the case. In 2001, advancements in DNA testing finally connected the dots. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Visalia ransacker were the same man. Authorities now knew they were looking for one offender responsible for at least 13 murders, 50 assaults, and over 100 burglaries across California. Yet the question remained: who was he? The answer would come not from fingerprints or witness accounts, but from a new kind of investigation, one that used the killer's own DNA to trace his family tree. In 2018, detectives uploaded the genetic profile taken from crime scene evidence to an online genealogy database called GED Match, a public site used by people researching their ancestry. Within days, they found distant relatives of the suspect. From there, a specialized genealogist helped map out potential facial Miley connections, narrowing it down to a few individuals living in California. One name stood out: Joseph James DeAngelo, a retired police officer who had once worked in the exact areas where the crimes occurred. Detectives began surveillance, collecting DNA from items he discarded, including a tissue thrown into a trash can. When the sample came back as a match to the Golden State Killer's profile, police moved in. At the time of his arrest, DeAngelo was living an ordinary suburban life in Citrus Heights. He had a fiancée, grown children, and neighbors who described him as quiet but easily irritated. None had any idea of his past. The revelation shocked the state. The idea that a man who had once served as law enforcement had secretly been one of California's most prolific murderers stunned even veteran officers. In 2018, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert announced to the press, "We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento." DeAngelo was charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping across 6 counties. Because many of his earlier assaults were beyond the statute of limitations, prosecutors focused on the murder cases. In 2020, facing overwhelming DNA evidence and testimony, DeAngelo agreed to plead guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. During his court appearance, he sat in a wheelchair, barely speaking above a whisper. Prosecutors detailed each crime as relatives of victims listened. Many had waited over 40 years for justice. When given the chance to speak, DeAngelo quietly said, "I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." The judge sentenced him to multiple life terms without parole. The case of Joseph James DeAngelo changed how investigators use DNA forever. The use of genealogical databases in his capture marked a turning point in forensic science and has since helped solve hundreds of cold cases across the United States. For decades, DeAngelo had lived among ordinary people, undetected. He attended family barbecues, went shopping, and rode his motorcycle through neighborhoods where his victims' families still lived. For survivors and families, his arrest was both a relief and a haunting reminder of how long justice can take. Joseph DeAngelo remains in prison today, the quiet old man who turned it out to be one of California's darkest secrets. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror defined an era of fear in California, a time when even locked doors couldn't guarantee safety. But his capture also marked the beginning of a new era, one where science finally spoke for the victims he silenced. From the dusty freeways of Los Angeles to the quiet streets of Sacramento, California, has always been a place of contrasts, sunshine and shadows, fame and fear, dreams and nightmares. Across decades, the state has seen it all. The smooth-talking drifter who haunted freeways, the manipulative landlady who buried secrets beneath her rose garden, the killers who worked in pairs, the ones who hid behind charm, and even the one who wore a badge while committing unspeakable crimes. Each of them was different. Their motives, their victims, their methods, yet every one of them shared something chilling, the ability to hide behind an ordinary face. They walked among friends, neighbors, co-workers, unnoticed until it was far too late, and for years their crimes stretched across California's freeways, suburbs, and coastlines, leaving behind fear that lingered long after they were caught. Because here evil didn't always lurk in the dark. Sometimes it smiled from across the street. So maybe the real question isn't why California bred so many monsters, but how many still walk among us, unnoticed. If you made it this far, I want to hear your thoughts. Which of these cases shocked you the most? And why do you think California, of all places, became the center of so many of these crimes? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I'll be reading every one of them. And if you want to see more true crime documentaries like this, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us again as we uncover the stories hidden behind America's darkest headlines. Because sometimes, the truth is even darker than the myths.